Unleashed on select cities in March, with a wide release April 10, 1981, The Howling was the first of three major werewolf pictures that year. Wolfen, released in July, and An American Werewolf in London in August. An effective advertising campaign downplayed the werewolf aspects, making The Howling look more like a slasher film, which were all the rage at the time. On a budget of about $1.5 million, the film brought home almost $18 million in box office earnings, making it a moderate success. Reviews were mostly positive. Rob Bottin's special effects were almost universally praised. Critics also appreciated the film's sense of humor and nods to werewolf movies of yesteryear. The Howling was seen as a welcome return to the genre which had previously been a dying breed. In an unusual role reversal, Roger Ebert hated the film, but his compatriot Gene Siskel really liked it. Usually they were the other way around on horror pictures. The critical consensus resembled Siskel's outlook. The film won a Saturn Award for Best Horror Film that year. Many now recognize The Howling as one of the all-time great werewolf pictures. It made the list of Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments at number 81. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film currently has a 72% critic score based on 39 reviews, and an audience score of 58% based on over 25,000 ratings. It was a bit unfortunate that it came out the same year as Wolfen and An American Werewolf in London, because it will always be dogged with comparisons to those films. That year was so influential to the genre, it triggered a resurgence of cinematic lycanthropes with films such as The Company of Wolves, 1984, Silver Bullet, and Teen Wolf, both 1985. The Howling spawned a pack of 7 sequels. Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf, 1985, Howling 3, 1987, Howling 4, The Original Nightmare, 1988, Howling 5, Rebirth, 1989, Howling 6, The Freaks, 1991, The Howling, New Moon Rising, 1995, and The Howling Reborn, 2011. Most agree that none of them have been able to match or surpass the original. The Howling 2 has the distinction of being the only sequel with input from author Gary Brandner, who wrote the novel that The Howling was based on. It's also the only sequel connected with the events of the first film. The Howling 4 was also based on Brandner's novel and followed it far more closely than the first film. In 2015, Netflix announced they were working on a remake of The Howling, and in 2020, director Andy Muschietti, 2017, became attached to the project. When will it come out? Perhaps when the moon is right. One theater goer who saw The Howling and liked it was none other than filmmaker extraordinaire Steven Spielberg. He liked it so much, in fact, that he tapped director Joe Dante and producer Michael Fennell to helm a cute, fuzzy little project he had been devising that just needed a little water thrown on it to become Gremlins, 1984. That film tips its hat to The Howling in subtle ways, like an Eddie Quist smiley face sticker on a refrigerator, and a few familiar faces in the cast. Spielberg was also impressed with the performance of Dee Wallace as Karen. He soon cast her in the role of Mary in another film you might have heard of, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, 1982. While E.T. is not exactly a scary movie, Wallace was making a name for herself as a scream queen after The Hills Have Eyes and now The Howling. She would keep this going with films like Cujo, 1983, and Critters, 1986. Dennis Dugan, who plays Chris, would have a long acting career ahead of him, as well as becoming a director of successful comedies, such as Adam Sandler vehicles Happy Gilmore, 1996, and Big Daddy, 1999. Dick Miller, who plays bookseller Walter Paisley, would be a fixture in all of Joe Dante's films, but he declared The Howling to be his favorite role of a long and productive career. Debate still rages about which film featured the best creature effects, this one or An American Werewolf in London. This dog-eat-dog competition turned out to be a good thing, since both movies pushed the special effects game forward in meaningful ways. Makeup wizard Rob Bottin was certainly a hot commodity after this success. He would soon reconnect with John Carpenter for The Thing, 1982, which allowed him to further explore his techniques with a much higher budget. The results were spectacular. While making The Howling, director Joe Dante was inspired by some of his favorite horror films like The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, and The Invisible Man, 1933, which broke up the scares with a healthy dose of comedy. He achieved this by putting in just about every werewolf cliché imaginable, as well as references to most notable werewolf movies, their characters and actors, props with images of wolves or the word wolf, and even more obscure details. The Howling is an unabashed love letter to the werewolf subgenre. The bookseller Walter Paisley presents the rules of werewolves as they appear in The Howling. For the most part, they are the same as the rules created by screenwriter Kurt Siodmak for 1941's The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. Speaking of Chaney, there's a framed picture of him in Dr. Wagner's office. George Wagner just happens to be the name of the director of The Wolfman. That film is seen playing on a TV more than once during The Howling and helps explain more werewolf lore in a subtle way. The Wolfman takes place in Llanwelly, Wales, and in The Howling, Dr. Wagner's colony is said to be in Llanwelly County. Many more characters are named after directors of earlier werewolf pictures, including Sam Newfield, The Mad Monster, 1942, Lou Landers, The Return of the Vampire, 1943, R. William Neal, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, 1943, Charles Barton, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, 1948, Terence Fisher, The Curse of the Werewolf, 1961, Jerry Warren, Face of the Screaming Werewolf, 1964, Jacinto Molina, La Marca del Hombre Lobo, 1968, and Freddie Francis, Legend of the Werewolf, 1975. Earl Kenton, the director of 1945's House of Dracula, is the name of the character played by John Carradine in The Howling, who starred as the title character in the earlier film. The morgue assistant tells of a mysterious case of Stuart Walker. A director by that name helmed the first major werewolf picture, Werewolf of London, 1935. At one point in the movie, the cartoon Little Boy Blue, 1936, is on a TV screen. Also the Warner Brothers cartoon Pigs in a Polka, 1943. Both are retellings of the Big Bad Wolf fairy tale. A picture of a wolf hunting sheep hangs above Karen and Bill's bed in the cabin. While in bed, Bill is reading You Can't Go Home Again by Thomas Wolfe. He's been bit by that point and probably won't be going home again. Chris has a copy of Allen Ginsberg's book Howl. The sheriff is eating Wolf brand chili at one point. A can of it is also visible inside the Quist cabin. There's a bottle of Wolfen brand medicine in the doctor's office. Bill mentions famous disc jockey Wolfman Jack. And then there's the really obscure stuff. When Karen returns to work after the first encounter with Eddie, the news producer says, "You'll be the cynosure of all eyes." Cynosure generally means center of attention, but comes from Greek translating to dog's tail. Earl mentions UFOs and cattle mutilation in the film. This is a reference to a project that screenwriter John Sayles was working on for Steven Spielberg at the time, known as Night Skies. The project ended up getting canceled, but parts of it became E.T. and Poltergeist, 1982. In Eddie's apartment, a newspaper clipping declares "Death by Man-Eating Piranha," which is a reference to Dante's previous film, Piranha. Belinda Balaski, who plays Terry in this scene, was in that film, and her character became fish food. Finally, the scene featuring Roger Corman waiting outside the phone booth is actually a nod to Rosemary's Baby, 1968, which had a similar scene featuring legendary genre filmmaker William Castle. Whew, did we forget any? Despite obvious and intentional comedy elements, The Howling is pretty darn scary. The first few minutes will scare off most of the squeamish. This sequence alone features nudity, rape, blood and violence, not to mention one sick puppy, Eddie. Once the action moves to the colony, things really start to heat up. The film features plenty of gore, full frontal nudity, and the most horrifying creature effects that had yet sullied the silver screen. Werewolves are obviously the stuff of make-believe, and as a result, the film lacks the sort of existential dread that a more believable premise may carry. But make no mistake, The Howling is not for the faint of heart. We give The Howling a Nightmare rating of 4 out of 5. This one will make your hair stand on end.